Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for being here tonight. Really appreciate it. I have been obviously part of the Leaders Club for a long time. It's a great privilege to bring my great friend and colleague, Dr. Susie Ballentyne, in with me as well. And we will do a bit more of an introduction to ourselves in just a moment. We are aiming to talk to you about exactly what it says on the slide. What next for leadership training in business? Our aim tonight is to talk about three things, having done a quick bit of intro to each of us for those that are slightly less familiar with me, because although I'm a regular feature here, I suspect you won't know everything I'm about to tell you in a minute. And we're also going to talk about where are we now with leadership training in business, where do we where do we want to get to, and how do we want to get there. And we'll cover that in some more detail in just a second. So jumping straight on, me, Susie has the academic qualifications for both of us. She'll talk more about that in a minute because I just jumped straight into the Air Force from school and did a quick 34.5 years doing that as a fighter pilot. Then went up the career ladder and did a number of kind of senior command roles and things that gave me a lot of insight into some serious leadership opportunities in the military, a lot of work in the MOD, allied to the civil service, and cross-government work as well. So I saw an awful lot of that. Then jumped into the corporate world, having left the Air Force back in 2015, did 3.5 years full-time with Deloitte, and then went independent just over 4 years ago. And that combination of things, I guess, has given me the thirst for what I do now, really, which is mainly around facilitation of leadership training. And I do a lot of work for Deloitte University. I'll talk more about them in a little while. And I also work for a number of other organizations as well, delivering a variety of different types of training. I'm a qualified coach. I'm a neuro-linguistic programming practitioner. And I also, out of interest, just host a leadership podcast, which I started about 10 months or so ago. And that is a mixture of things, but includes a lot of interviews with people who have fascinating insights about leadership in the round and really do share very openly some of their own ups and downs of their own journeys. So, it's definitely taught me a lot. As well as just being fascinating to do it. But enough about me. Susie?
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to meet everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to come along and join Bob for this presentation. So I'm a social psychologist, slightly different maybe from some of the psychologists you may have come across in different roles. Leadership is traditionally a space for occupational psychology, but over the last almost 25 years now, I've worked for government. Primarily in defence and with the SCDO. And I've been doing an awful lot of training, primarily for our overseas diplomatic staff, around everything from team working to leadership development. A lot of what I do is about interpersonal skills development for relationship building within overseas missions and between them. So as a social psychologist, understanding the social context, political drivers, and cultural differences is a big part of what I do. I also am trained to deliver various psychometrics. So I do a lot of coaching and teamwork using various psychological tools, which primarily focus on interpersonal relationship development within the work environment, but also looking at managing change and transition, which blends what I do in my work along with my doctoral studies, which was looking at the role of social identity and changes in social identity and the impact that has on specifically on asylum-seeking forced migrants. So for the past 7 years, I've been working with Syrians, Ukrainians, and looking at UK asylum policy and looking at how our social identity impacts our resilience and ability to cope with change, which is something that is being carried out for the first time in the space of forced migration, but has an awful lot of implications for life and work. So I bring quite a lot of that into my work now. I'm based with the FCDO in London and soon to be posted to Canberra with my husband. So I'll be carrying on my work there a little bit with DFAT, Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. Bob and I met when we were both working in the Ministry of Defence. bringing behavioural science to support policy making. So that's a sort of broad background where I bring some of my insights for today.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. And I guess the other bit in terms of that broader background is that meeting in the MOD back when I was running the Targeting and Information Operations Directorate, and obviously it was the information operations side of it that connected me to Susie. Is what ultimately brought us back together again with the work that I do now. Because when I founded Leading for Life, Susie joined me in founding that, and we've got lots of, I think, very common ground, but also lots of interesting points of difference. I mean, I've made the joke about academic qualifications, but I think she does have a very different experience set to me, and that makes us very complementary, and it's really helpful in the kind of conversations we've been having. So hopefully some of that will come out with what we present tonight, and under whatever questions you throw at us as well. But moving on, Susie's going to come in on the end of this section, and then we'll sort of swap over as we get a little bit later into the presentation, where we'll do it the other way around. But my take on this is what's on the slide. Essentially, recruitment, by and large, by corporates, is done on experience and or qualifications, absolutely not on leadership potential. There's no real focus on that at all by any corporate I've come across, literally bar none. Mostly training is business specific to get you better at delivering profitability for the business, and much less on leadership. There are exceptions to that, and I'll come back to those in a bit. But it is an area that certainly is not a strong suit for lots of organizations. Promotions are almost invariably focused on business delivery and business performance, not on leadership potential. So if you're doing well and you're selling well in a selling kind of business, you're probably going to get promoted. And many people who work in corporates will have seen people go to the very top of the organization who have had zero leadership experience in terms of training. They've gained some experience by virtue of having teams, but sometimes even people who are frankly pretty toxic leaders make it pretty high up into organizations just because they are very good at what that business does. And that is a challenge. There are equally some outstanding leaders who make it to the top who have got natural leadership ability, as it says on the bottom bullet. So the quality is extremely variable, and that in itself presents a challenge. Susie, anything you want to throw on as well?
Yeah, I think, as we come on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about sometimes why that is. Where these changes have come from, and what the kind of organizational and social shifts that are happening that mean that organizations then behave and reinforce and reward in these particular ways, because there's always a kind of why behind why these things are actually occurring.
And that brings us to that: what is the challenge out of all of that? And I think it's it's multifaceted for sure. The reality is good leadership is extremely important. It's always been that way. It's becoming arguably increasingly important in this space for reasons we'll get to in just a second. But it is vital. If you want to retain people, if you want to build brand reputation, then it requires good leadership to do that. People are going to get frustrated if they're poorly led, no question about it, and they're absolutely expecting. And again, I think modern generation more than many in the past, expecting that people are going to invest in their own personal development, and they have a very reasonable expectation of that happening. So good leadership is required to drive that kind of behaviour forward. Leaders themselves aren't going to feel terribly great about it if they don't have the tools. I mentioned a minute ago the company I was dealing with last year who said exactly that to me. They were finding it very difficult that they didn't have what they felt were the right tools to do the job well, and that is a problem. But potentially the biggest two are the bottom ones. The changing face of the world of work here is really going to make a difference to what leaders in business do. We're in a world which post-COVID, arguably other things have changed it as well, has changed immeasurably, where now you're looking at hybrid working being the default, and a lot of people working from home, lots of people arguably almost never going into the office, as opposed to the pre-runner to COVID. Even in a world where they're not in an office, they're in a manufacturing environment or one which is mixed, then the kind of nature of that and how they're working is different. AI is going to make an enormous difference to these sorts of things. And other pressures, other values that particularly the newer Generation Z, are firmly applying in this space become a real issue. So climate, for example, one of the things I do when I work with Deloitte University, and I tend to facilitate their senior manager courses and their director courses, and also some high impact leadership courses for their senior managers. They all have an issue, without exception. Every single course, this will be raised as a topic, with working with the younger generation who are coming in and finding that their own difference in experience, difference in kind of value set, the way they've been brought up, is being challenged quite rightly and very successfully by the new generation. And that is, I think, is a really interesting dynamic that leaders in business are going to have to face increasingly as they go forward. Because if they want to keep people, they've actually got to turn around and have a value set that matches up to those people's own expectations. And that is undeniable, I think. Susie?
Yeah, I think to that latter point about the kind of Gen Z coming through and the challenging organisations, which I always kind of err on the side of caution that that's not necessarily seen as a negative thing, and something where they need to then conform to how organisations work, but really encourage organisations to think, what are the changes in the way that people conduct themselves, behave, perform in the workplace that is different? How does that speak to diversity and thinking about different ways of working? And what sort of organizational culture are you creating? If you're creating one where challenge is not welcome and compliance is rewarded, which one could argue is a sort of far more sort of outdated mode of organizational structure, then it's going to be trying to get a square peg in a round hole. If we think of challenge in a more healthy and progressive way, in terms of the kind of Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, and thinking about challenge in terms of having safe spaces in which to encourage confident and challenging conversations where people can be quite candid and respectful, but feel that they have a voice, then that challenge could be incredibly beneficial to the organisation. So I think these changes are really interesting and offer a lot of opportunity for thinking about different ways of doing things, which, as I say, speaks to the diversity agenda about not doing the same way and not trying to organise work systems in ways we've always done them, and to resist that change, but ask ourselves, what does this change offer in terms of opportunities for our business?
Fab, thank you. So moves us on to the second thing. Where do we want to get to? What looks good here in this this sort of space? Well, I mean, I personally think this chap actually said it pretty well when he was quoted saying this, that essentially, if you do train people well, then they can leave, but you want to treat them well enough that they don't want to leave. And any organisation doing that, I think, is is going to be doing the right thing. The interesting thing for me is that just about every organisation, including the very good ones who do actually do lots of training and focus on the kind of right things, in my opinion, on this, the first thing that gets axed when there's any budgetary pressure is training, almost invariably, and without real thought to the consequences of that. So a few other thoughts on the where we want to be bit, though, are actually baking this in, so it goes from the start of somebody's career journey rather than it being something that is a bit ad hoc as you go through. I think it's a truism. This is when people often ask me, and I suspect those that are on this call as well, who are ex-military, will have had the similar experience, that people often ask, what's the difference between the kind of way companies do leadership training and the military does it? One of the big differences, without a doubt, is that the military, right at the beginning, teaches you to lead people before actually it teaches you to do anything else. So I did leadership training long before I started flying training, for example, and that obviously is hugely valuable. You also have huge amounts of opportunity to actually do leadership and lead groups of people, which I think is immensely valuable in itself. And you get a whole load of through life training that is kind of topping up that as you go. Now, I think it's a realism point to say that no company really is going to afford the opportunity or direct fiscal cost of saying you're going to jump in and do that kind of equivalence. But there are lots of similarities in the way that you can bring some training together and do it well. And I mean, I mentioned Deloitte University before. They do this well. They do definitely do, you know, quite good, quite robust, and very widespread milestone training that, you know, is very leadership focused, and that's a really good thing. Why? Because the second bullet there, the tone from the top is right. They are focusing on knowing to some extent that perhaps they didn't get the right thing when they were going through the system, and they're improving it for the people that follow. And that's absolutely great if you can get into that position where you've got leaders that recognize that you know, actually we could have done this better, and let's find a way of actually doing it better. Do it on a building block basis. Do it to you know, to develop the you know, the relevant business skills in parallel with that leadership development piece is, you know, is obviously an obvious thing to do. But don't just focus on business skills. Focus on bringing some leadership stuff in as well. And I'm personally of the view that I get the remote training thing. I mean, we were forced into this world when the pandemic hit. To some extent, it is still, you know, very valid if you've got global teams and you're trying to pull them together, and that's the only way you can do it. And then it's obviously more valuable than not doing it at all. But there is no question that doing it face to face makes an enormous difference. And what an awful lot of organizations did as well was offered a very, very much shortened remote alternative to something that was a physical course that they would have done before COVID. And again, just to exemplify the point, the Deloitte University training. So if I look at a 3.5 day senior manager course, during COVID, we were doing that in 3.5 hours on a Zoom call. I mean, quite obviously you can't replicate the two things. They're not comparable. And you know, everyone that went through that virtual training got something, but inevitably nothing like as much. And some of the points that I'll come on to in a second, I think are particularly important with that. But Susie?
Yeah, just 2 points on that, Bob. The first one is about, you know, getting in upstream, which I think, you know, I worked for a long time in defence and had many military colleagues, and the competencies that we would see quite early on were the very kind of foundation building block skills of leadership that were introduced at a very early stage of their career. And I would argue that actually we wouldn't even necessarily call them leadership skills from the outset or putting them in upstream. They're actually just very good interpersonal, team-based rapport building skills around understanding the needs of others, understanding the, you know, purpose of work, working together, good communication, which actually are incredibly important skills for all team members. So that idea of kind of building them up towards leadership is, you're not necessarily teaching leadership early, you're teaching the foundation stones that together, when that person rises to that particular position in the organization, become the essential ingredients for leadership. So I think there's many ways in which you can look at capitalizing on some really good training that's already there and thinking about those as the kind of foundation stones that move towards leadership. The other thing about the face-to-face versus online is I think also there's a question around in which context are people going to be leaders, because we tend to make an assumption sometimes that leaders are always going to be face-to-face, and I know an awful lot of people who have to lead digitally. They have to do it through largely through emails and Zoom calls. And I think it's important that we recognise there's an awful lot of research that's been done on this, especially at Bath University, about how we work together differently in digital spaces versus face-to-face spaces. And so trying to find comparable and complementary ways in training people online could be exactly the right space should the culture and needs of your organisation mean that you're going to be operating that way. So I think it's about aligning the need and the reality of how these organisations work, rather than finding a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, I picked up on, there was a question popped up in chat about that. What's the evidence for face-to-face being preferable or more effective than online? I think I totally agree with everything you've just said, Susie. Actually, I think I worked with a company a while ago on a consulting project, not a leadership development project, where actually online had been a great leveler for them, because what ended up happening was they'd had a global team with a kind of UK hub and a load of remote outstations from Hong Kong to Washington, DC. And what they previously had when they had their team calls was obviously the hub was in an office having a face-to-face meeting. All the others were kind of remote outstations and were very much the poor relations in the conversation, which made it very difficult for them. The working in an online way had made it much more level playing field because everyone was on Teams as it was, and they were all basically equal in terms of what they were able to contribute and how they were playing into the meeting. And I think developing leaders to be able to lead like that is really important. I would argue quite strongly, and my evidence is entirely kind of anecdotal, if you like, and basically based on feedback from people, not least who I work with and facilitate for, is in training them to do this, doing it face to face makes a huge difference. And not least because the amount of time you can space, and you generally have. The interaction you have is clearly different as well, rather than actually doing it as online training to be effectively an online leader. That's kind of where I was coming from, but very happy to develop that further when we get into Q&A in a while. Okay, so what do they need in order to get to a better place? I think is the next question that all of this begs. I would argue, and Susie's going to add on to this as well, that the things down the left-hand side are helpful here. Tools, tips, ideas. That's the kind of stuff you get from training for sure, but they also need experience, and they need experiential training. Maybe was really beneficial for sure if you go and do some of the stuff that takes people out of comfort zones and puts them into a place that's a bit more challenging and different to where they've been, and makes them stronger as individuals and leaders, then that's a really good thing. They also need opportunities to actually lead. If you just do the training and actually you never get an opportunity to lead anybody, that's not a lot of use, frankly, because it's not going to get you to where you need to be at all. There's a whole load of bits that build on from this, and the things in the bubble there are the kind of areas that I think are relevant, that you should be trying to develop people's skills for. And we will talk specifically about a few of them. I'm going to touch on two that I see all the time, and I'll come back to my face-to-face versus online point. The amount of people that really struggle to do networking well and consequently build relationships well is surprising. I think for those of us who've been around a while, if you're a bit more extrovert, you find this really easy. You kind of look at this and go, well, this isn't a challenge at all. But the reality is, for an awful lot of people that I work with, it absolutely is. They despise networking. They really don't enjoy it at all. And they don't have any kind of process before you start working with them to develop one for how they're going to do it better and actually make it more productive and more useful, and how they're going to do relationship development and relationship management better and make that more productive and more useful, and ultimately in a business context turn that into potential sales and clients, etc., etc. So those are areas that most definitely are skill set development opportunities that aren't perhaps immediately obvious, but definitely are ones that I think are highly sought after. Susie?
Yeah, I'm just going to lightly touch on these because I think I'll come back to some of them in a moment. But I think, probably if you're working in the field of leadership, then you will have come across emotional intelligence a huge amount. And, this is something that certainly in my work, both in defence and FCDO, we've been looking at quite a lot in terms of understanding what it is, demystifying the idea of emotional intelligence a little bit, and getting people to focus on emotional intelligence being something that you do rather than something that you have. It's about the way in which you recognise what is going on for you, what's going on for the other person, and trying to align that to best effect. It's often underpinned by, and Talergy, who train a lot of this work in emotional intelligence with things like the emotional intelligence tool profile, say that there are kind of two foundations to that, which is self-awareness and attitude, that part and parcel of how we go about making decisions, communicating with people, motivating them in the workplace is often about our attitude to ourselves and our attitude to other people, i.e., do we hold ourselves and other people in high regard? Or do we go in assuming that we know better here and people will listen and get with the program? So the kind of fundamental psychological attitude that can underpin a lot of this and can shape people's self-awareness. One of the absolute primary things that we train in the Foreign Office now is self-awareness. It's about encouraging people to be much more reflective about their own personality, interpersonal style, communication style, to recognise the diversity in that, and to move away from the idea of sort of fixed leadership types or traits, and getting people to understand that there are many different ways in which they can develop their skills. So, for example, to Bob's point about networking, yes, networking is an incredibly useful leadership skill and competence. But through self-awareness, some people will recognise that that is far more challenging for them than other people. It may be that they are less extrovert. It may be, if you're thinking about it, and I don't know if any of you have used the FIRE-OB, Fundamental Interpersonal Relationship Orientation Behaviours, developed by Will Schutz, who did a lot of work in developing small critical teams with submariners, and his work has gone on to look at some really interesting things about different people's needs in the workplace. That some people need different things from their work environment. They're looking to have those needs satisfied. Some people can walk into the room and network and those needs are satisfied immediately. For somebody else, that is absolutely overwhelming for them. And that's something they don't need, and they'll actively avoid it. So how can we recognise that different people operate and think and use the work environment in different ways, and help them develop the right skills, competencies, and behaviours that allow them to do their job? So I'll come back a little bit to that in a minute, but just finally to say, you know, and I think you know, Ed Shine's work on humility and the humble leadership, if you've looked at that, has been really critical, and something that has signposted a really important shift away from the leader as the sort of more powerful kind of single voice in an environment, towards leadership as the person who, you know, to use Stephen Covey's work, you know, seek first, understand, then be understood, the active listener who can recognise what is going on in the workplace with the people who they work with, and listen and respond to challenge in a healthy and productive way, which requires considerable amounts of humility. But that's not always what's rewarded in the workplace, and does require egos to be set to one side often, but is incredibly powerful in terms of motivating teams to deliver.
Thanks, Susie. So then, how do we get there? I'm going to name check. I've already done it with Deloitte University, but the other organisation that I want to just call out here is KWC Global, who I also do quite a lot of work for in this space, not least because I'm going to reference one of their models in just a second. But I think there are opportunities to tap, you know, training organizations that really do have tools that work. A lot of the work is nothing new under the sun. There are things that have been out there for absolutely ages. I mean, I'm just going to throw up a few models that I'm, again, always surprised how sometimes, you know, these are really unfamiliar to people who have been, you know, in many instances in business for a long time and actually just have not really come across this. If you start bottom right and you talk about competence, going from unconscious incompetence through to unconscious competence at the top end of that, and just recognizing that is a journey, and that you have to think about that. And using analogies, I tend to talk about driving, and because most people can relate to that. As you know, when you first get in a car, then obviously you haven't got a clue, and you are, you might think you're going to be the best driver ever, but you actually don't have the first idea. Whereas actually, when you've been driving for a few years, for sure, you don't even think about it. You get in the car, you drive it. You actually probably you'll go along for big chunks of a journey and not even think about. You'll suddenly go, I've been driving for half an hour and I've thought nothing about what I've actually done at all, and that is proper unconscious competence. The top right one, I think, is also very interesting in the context of leaders, particularly around moving people out of comfort zones to stretch them and get them to be familiar with stretching themselves to get a bigger comfort zone, and by definition a bigger stretch zone and less panic zone. And actually I use the same analogy around driving, because I'll say to people, most of the time you're driving around, you're in your comfort zone, probably you're absolutely fine, but occasionally if you've either had an accident or come close to having one, you'll have moved pretty quickly from comfort into panic. But actually you still learn from it generally. There'll be things you take away from that experience that will, hopefully modify things that you behave, the way you drive the next time. And that's true with just about everything, where actually if you deliberately stretch yourself, that's a really good space to be in. Top left, Johari's window. I think Susie is going to be much better qualified to talk about the detail of some of this sort of stuff with her academic background. But just getting to a space where your open area, what is known to you and to others, is much bigger, and the blind area, unknown area, and hidden area are much smaller, is a really good thing to do if you're a leader, if you're trying to get to a place where people understand you and you understand them and can make really be relatable. And it goes back to that self-awareness and emotional intelligence that Susie was talking about a second ago. Bottom left is the KWC global framework that I said I'd bring up, where actually we just turn around and talk to people in terms of developing pitches or developing structures to go into a meeting or any form of plan. Just actually having a process around analyzing what you're going to do, what you actually want, what's the outcome you actually want to achieve, thinking about that through a brainstorming process before you get into just constructing something, i.e. a PowerPoint deck or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever else you're going to produce, is a really valuable way of relating to this. Then you deliver it, and the thing that I think corporates often very, very poor at is the evaluation bit. They just don't do that. They don't go back and harvest all the goodness of what's gone on, where actually that's a really, really valuable thing to do. So those frameworks, and I don't want to dive into them too deeply now, are just interesting, I think, in terms of the sort of skills you can bring to bear in some of this that are highly relevant to leaders going through the process today.
Can I just make a point about the competency ladder? Because I use this an awful lot in my work as well, and I just think it's just worthwhile noting that point about unconscious competence. And we struggle, I think, in government with this, that we look at very competent leaders, and certainly new recruits will come in and look at very competent leaders, and because it's unconscious competence, those leaders find it quite difficult to articulate what it is that they do as leaders. And we've struggled with this because if you can't understand what good leaders do because it's become unconscious, then you can't train it. So part of the requirement, certainly for behavioural scientists like me working in government, is how do you unpick unconscious competence? So how do you interview really effective, quite senior leaders and find out how it is that they do what they do, how they make their decisions? And there are some really useful frameworks around Gary Klein's work on cognitive task analysis and critical decision making, which allows you to do an evaluation, to interview senior leaders and actually look at their key decision points and unpick, bring it back into the conscious mind about how they do what they do. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to develop a kind of training needs analysis and think what it is that leadership looks like in our organization. But it's quite difficult to articulate because, and then myths appear over the fact that certain people just have this amazing X factor. Some leaders are just born with it. And that, of course, nobody ever is. But when something becomes a very habituated, built-in skill, like leadership, unconscious competence, it's very difficult to understand, especially for new recruits, that this is a process of learning that you have to go through. And that bit of being consciously incompetent is a really difficult stage. And you'll quite often lose people at that point because they cannot see a way through. So kind of clarifying and making that top level more transparent is an important way of giving people hope that they too can get to that level as well.
That's a really great point. Thanks very much. And sticking with you, Susie.
Yes. So and I've sort of slightly touched on this already in terms of focusing on leadership as an activity rather than a characteristic. And I think one of the things I certainly noticed shifting where I work and with conversations with various business and occupational psychologists I work with is focusing more on the behavior and less about the type of person, because getting caught up in types and traits is only helping us understand half the story. But it's a very lucrative industry to have publishing houses create personality psychometrics, leadership psychometrics to find that ideal type. But actually that can be quite unhelpful because it leads to sometimes using tools that are just not suitable for the organizational culture, using tools that aren't suitable for the actual, global culture in which you're working, bringing in a kind of fixed sense of what type is going to work and people thinking that there is a right and a wrong, rather than understanding leadership as a flexible awareness about what the situation requires and who is the person in front of me. So I think, going back to that very first slide about the changing nature of organizational structures, this idea that there is a type that will work well can be quite outdated. And if you're looking to recruit particular types of people or develop particular people in a particular way, then that can often lead to quite a rigid and quite sort of often elitist, and certainly not a very diverse way of understanding the various ways in which people can perform as leaders and behave as leaders. So the focus really is on the doing, which, if we move to the next slide, what does that actually look like? What should leaders be doing? I mean, there is vast literature out there in terms of what it is that we should actually be looking for. If I had to pick my top four, these are the kind of 4 C's that I would go with in terms of offering an answer to what leaders should be doing. First and foremost, connection is absolutely fundamental, and this can be online or offline, but human connection and recognizing that leadership is a competence and a skill that requires one human being to work with, connect through, and deliver through other people is absolutely fundamental. That requires the humility, the sort of work that Ed Shine's been doing on humble leadership, and the ability to develop empathy, to be able to be curious, to understand what is happening in my team, what is it my customers require, holding back on assumptions, not making judgments, and giving oneself time to use that kind of rich resource of other people's perspectives to get a really honest and diverse take on a problem. The second point is about, and I've alluded to this already in terms of Amy Emerson's work on psychological safety, cultivating a psychologically safe team. So a culture which supports candor, listening to concerns, admitting mistakes, being willing to fail well, which, and I know this from working with lots of teams, can be quite a challenging, quite a scary space for some teams, and certainly some leaders, to think about, because there are often fixed ways of dealing with problems, of analysing problems, to Bob's earlier point about the model he was using, and encouraging people to question and challenge and give different opinions can be unsettling. And so leadership at that point requires the confidence and the humility to be able to say, what's going on here, or why didn't this work, and what can we learn from it? Third, and I think this is really interesting research, and this certainly from my work as a social psychologist very much relates to the area that I work in, which is led by Steve Reicher and Alex Haslam, 2 social psychologists who've done this work on identity leadership, which is looking at leadership as a skill that requires people to craft a sense of us. So it's about moving teams away from a collection of I's, a collection of individuals with a common purpose, and creating a sense of us. So there is a shared purpose, a shared identity, which is both psychologically and strategically rewarding. So people identify with the team, they feel they belong, they feel it has meaningful purpose, and that through that creates huge motivational rewards, which then, when delivered and directed well by the leader, can be very strategically rewarding as well. So the sense of shared social identity is about having a sense that this is my team, we belong together, and that crafting of purpose and meaning and identity is part of the skill of identity leadership. Finally, it's the creating through others, and thinking about quite broadly in quite diverse ways, and diversity in its full sort of spectrum of meaning in terms of experience, ideas, backgrounds, to think in innovative ways to deliver solutions and results and services, by creating the space, by creating the right culture to allow people to think freely and openly in terms of how they're actually going to meet problems or deliver results. So there's huge literature on all of those. Those would be the ones that I would say are probably, from my experience, quite key. And I think especially the one on the identity leadership and crafting a sense of us is something that is particularly interesting in Western cultures, where we come from cultures which are much more independent rather than interdependent, and much more about rewarding the individual rather than looking at collective incentives and collective rewards. So I'll leave you with those, but very happy to take more questions on those at the end.
Thanks, Susie. And that takes us pretty neatly to the end. The last point I was going to make is building on what you talked about with psychometrics and personality types, because it's something that you and I have talked about a lot, and it's something I use your comment to me from a few years back a lot when I do facilitation. In that, lots of businesses do use psychometrics, 4-box quadrant psychometrics that say your whatever percentage mix of this particular type of things. Deloitte have one which is called business chemistry, and you're either a driver, a pioneer, an integrator, or a guardian, and you're a percentage of all of those. And Susie's comment to me was, yeah, but actually what that does, if you're not careful, is it gives you an excuse for the behavior you exhibit, which I think is a really powerful thing that I do mention a lot to people now. And I think personally, I think they have a lot of use in some areas, not least in understanding other people and looking at, okay, this is notionally what I am, but what are the other people that are here, and how can I get the best out of them to do all the things that actually Susie's got on that last slide, which I think is really, really powerful kind of point that comes from it.
Yeah.
Susie, final point.
I just on that point about psychometrics are enormously helpful, and I use them a lot in team development and coaching work. But they are the springboard to a conversation, and it's in the conversation that the value really comes out. And I have seen cultural change programs and organizations rolled out where people will hold their type, and it actually just creates more rigid behaviors. And it should be building self-awareness. It should be thinking about how to to use your diagram, Bob, that moving out of your comfort zone, stretching, thinking, yeah, what, I am generally quite a details person, but in order to do this job, I also need to think with more of a big picture, blue skies, kind of a way of thinking. How can I do that? What you tend to do is, once people have a piece of paper that somebody has said, this is your type, it can just reinforce that sort of box mentality. And some of them simply just don't have a tremendous amount of psychological validity. I mean, Myers-Briggs is a brilliant tool for having conversations, but it lacks considerable amount of psychological validity.
Yeah, fabulous. Thanks, Susie. It takes us neatly to questions. I don't think either of us would pretend for a second that we know all the answers. We have a degree of experience. We've done a bunch of stuff in the world of work in various guises, and hopefully we've stimulated some thought.